And David,
Well, hello and welcome back to our seminar series co-hosted by the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego and the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. Thanks for joining us to discuss today's book, Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrants, Inequality in America. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to share a brief programming note. On May 20th at this hour, we're co-hosting a methods workshop on government data in migration research, advantages, pitfalls, and examples, led by Professors Austin Kocher of the Transactional Records Clearinghouse, TRAC, at Syracuse University, Caitlin Patler of UC Davis, Juan Pedrosa of UC Santa Cruz, and Alicia Riley of UC Santa Cruz. You can find information about the May 20th methods workshop and all of our upcoming events at the websites of both of the sponsoring centers. In today's panel, we're fortunate to be joined by Susan Eckstein. She is professor in the Pardee School of Global Studies and the Sociology Department at Boston University. And she'll be presenting her book, which is coming out this month or the next from Cambridge University Press, titled again, Cuban Privilege. Our discussant is César Ayala. He is professor of sociology at UCLA. The order of activities today is that Susan will give about a 30-minute presentation, overview of the book. César will then give a 10 to 15-minute comment, and we'll throw it back to Susan for a brief reaction, and then open it up to a general discussion. So with that time, if you would like to simply unmute yourself, you can raise your hand electronically and I'll unmute you, or you can put your question into the chat function and I'll pose it to the speaker. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Susan Eckstein.
I'll talk a few seconds before I start my presentation.
Keep talking.
Okay. So anyway, I'm delighted that you people are here today. And in a minute, I'm going to disappear and give a talk based on part of my book. And you can see a picture of it here. And actually, I will begin by giving you a sense of this picture on the cover, which I'm not sure it meets my aesthetic standards, but meets my historic standards. And it's actually an unbelievable picture. It's of Cubans in Miami, heading for Miami, in Havana, getting ready to take off in rafts, and look at the people in the streets of Havana watching while they are doing this unauthorized activity. To me, I was really surprised to see that, how it was almost a collective event when people were starting to leave. And this was, I think, in 1994 with the so-called rafter crisis. So that's just to give you a little sense, and let me now start talking about the book. And naturally, I'm only talking about certain aspects of the book, and otherwise we'd be here forever. So my book, as the title, as you can see, is Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America. So usually we hear, when we focus on inequities with immigrants, we think of the the Haitians, the Mexicans, the Central Americans. And actually in my book, I do discuss Haitians. I don't do the same quality of research as I did with Cubans, but it's like a control case to highlight the kinds of privileges that Cubans got. These are essentially neighboring countries in the Caribbean that have been treated totally differently by the United States. So in contrast to the experience of Central Americans, Mexicans, and Haitians, Cubans have been privileged. And a lot of the entitlements that they've gotten are really not well known. And I found myself by surprise, sort of on an investigative trip, constantly uncovering new entitlements that they've gotten over the years. And just trying to understand them. And so I'm actually not even sharing all of the entitlements, and obviously some are more important than others, but they're quite striking. So if trying to understand immigrant differences, analysts tend to focus either on individual attributes of the immigrants themselves, the timing of their entries, such as the opportunities that existed at the time. And what I'm really raising is the issue of different treatment by the state. So my argument is that left underanalyzed in immigrant studies is how the US has officially treated immigrant groups unequally. And my book will describe how and explain why the US has privileged Cubans over all other immigrants since 1959. So the book focuses on successively under different administrations, presidential administrations, the entitlements that were extended to Cubans, the occasional ones that were retracted. And as I said, I do make comparisons with Haitians, although not in this presentation, but we can talk about it if you want in the Q&A. So let me get going. My argument is a path-dependent argument. And in a way, again, for time, I really can't go in. And a lot of people who focus on path dependence, that this what happened, then that happened, then that happened, but not really to look at the relationship of that sequencing. And what I've done is show that when an administration has tried to stop the entitlements, they failed. Not only did they fail, but they wound up extending new entitlements to Cubans, which was really quite interesting to me when I uncovered that. So you people need no introduction, but I just want to center in the context of US immigration policy that before 1965 was racist, based on national origins, favoring people from Northern Europe. In 1965, partly because US immigration policy was so criticized for its racism, the new 65 immigration reform went into effect that substituted family and skills on a so-called preference basis system to substitute ostensibly to substitute for the national origins basis. Sorry, and what I want to say here is that yes, there has been this shift in policy, except if you're Cubans. Cubans, in essence, have continued to get entitlements on the basis of nationality, although they were not a privileged group before 1959. And we'll see how and why. So just to analytically kind of summarize some of the entitlements that are given, it's pan-partisan, both by Republican and by Democratic administrations, and at presidential discretion and by Congress. So here is just listing some of the types of entitlements that they've gotten, which I will go into. Entry privileges, rights to enter without authorization, rights to refugee benefits when they're not refugees, rights to welfare when other unauthorized immigrants don't qualify, and authorized immigrants have to wait 5 years. And they get support from the Reagan administration to turn them into an interest group so they can lobby. They can lobby and influence through PAC that they form. They influence Congress, they influence presidents, et cetera. And so it helped extend the influence that Cubans themselves came to have on US-Cuban policy in general, including US-Cuban immigration policy. So now let me go into some of these unique entitlements. About 1/3 Cubans were, I'm sorry, you can look at the dates if you want. I won't repeat all the dates if you're interested, because you'll see they are happening at under different administrations. So there's an airlift by really 4 administrations, from the Eisenhower through the Nixon administration, that brought about 1/3 Cubans to the US, whose lives were not endangered. They were not as such refugees. They were not, most of them, I should say, were not suffering persecution. And what is most remarkable is President Johnson, when he signed the 1965 Immigration Act, said, we are entering national origins admissions. We are admitting people for who they are, not where they're from. He pauses after this well-crafted speech in front of the Statue of Liberty and says, all Cubans are welcome. Remarkable, you know, after saying we've stopped admitting people on the basis of national origins. So let me go on some of these entitlements. The US has let Cubans in as tourists when there were no not to be, as a way to get around immigration restrictions. And then once tourists, they were able to stay, become LPRs, legal permanent residents, citizens, etc. Then one of the key entitlements is parolement. Parolement means something different in immigration than it does in criminal justice system. And what it means is giving temporary entry rights. And so Cubans have, since the beginning of the revolution, have been able to be, which was in 1959, under Eisenhower, have been able to be paroled into the country, even when they enter without authorization. And that sort of gets formalized in what is popularly known in 1994 as the wet foot, dry foot policy, meaning the dry foot policy means if you touch US land, you have the path that I just outlined, but it existed before 1994. So then another key entitlement is the Cuban Adjustment Act, passed in 1996 under President Johnson, who really, he crafted, well, he was a master craftsperson in terms of dealing with people, members of Congress, and he engineered passage of the Cuban Adjustment Act when an earlier act had failed. And this allowed any Cuban, after 1 year in the United States on parole, they could adjust their status to that of legal permanent resident on a path to citizenship. So that those two, the paroling and the Cuban Adjustment Act, are like in a stratosphere of their own in terms of entitlements for Cubans. So then the US has guaranteed a minimum of legal immigrants to Cubans. Again, no other country has such a guaranteed minimum. And that is a minimum of 20,000. Most countries have a maximum of 20,000. For Cuba, it's a minimum of 20,000. Also, the US grants Cubans rights to welfare. And as I said, at a time when other unauthorized immigrants could never qualify and other authorized immigrants needed to wait 5 years. Remarkably, the US also has invented or created, constructed categories to admit Cubans and to give them entitlements that they otherwise would not qualify for. So one that was remarkable was called Entrance Status Pending by Carter in 1988. This is with the Mariels, the 125 or so Mariel so-called boat lift. And Carter tried to keep them from coming. It was an election year. He knew it would do him in if he would have been done in by other things as well. So he's trying to keep the Cubans out, but he fails. So they come, and then not only does he let them in, he gives them a special title so that they would not be deported. And then it becomes the basis on which they're also given a remarkable set of refugee and resettlement benefits. And Clinton did something less ambitious, but there were less Cubans involved in 1994 with the so-called rafters. He also was trying to keep them out of the US because he too was running for re-election, not that year as Carter had to experience, but two years later, and he's already running, right? So he had them diverted, drawing on the lessons of Mariel, which were very unpopular. Clinton has them diverted to Guantanamo. And there, of course, it's all crazy. What do you do with all these Cubans in Guantanamo, right? They're protesting, and it's actually a mess. But he keeps them out of the straits of Florida, so that he's not on the front page of, you know, the daily news, or not just the New York Times, but in other words, to limit the impact, the negative impact that the rafters were having on Clinton himself. So he invented this status for these Guantanamo Cubans that was called Guantanamo entrance. And that became a basis on which he, officially brought the immigrants who were, no, they weren't immigrants, Cubans in Guantanamo to the United States. So they then enter sort of officially and not as unauthorized immigrants. So then, also remarkably, Cubans are admitted as refugees and entitled to refugee benefits when they are not officially refugees. They're called refugees, but they don't meet the official definition of refugee, which is somebody who suffers persecution or can demonstrate likely persecution. And Cubans, literally starting from when in 1959, Castro comes to power, January 1st, or the beginnings of coming to power, and any Cuban who came after that point was let into the country. You did not have to prove that you were suffering persecution. So they were admitted really as imagined refugees. And that gave them access to the most generous refugee program in US history. I mean, entitlements that are really remarkable, job training, job placement, university education, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1980, again, it was quite remarkable. Many of these things are remarkable, hence my constantly using the word. So under Carter, the Cubans, well, the US had just passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which remains the basis of refugee admissions. And Carter, too, this is under Carter, and to Carter's credit, he said that the Cubans, the Mariels, were not refugees, that they did not meet the definition of refugee that was embedded in the Refugee Act of 1980. So the question then was how to get them in, which was the special entrance status, and then how do you give them benefits? So the Refugee Education Assistance Act was passed in 1980, and incorporated into that were entitlements for Cubans to be given refugee benefits, literally as if they were refugees, even though they were known, and as Carter said, they were not refugees. They've also been exempt from refugee requirements to which other immigrants are subjected, such they need not enter through official ports of entry. They're exempt from the preference system that applies to other immigrants. So that's sort of the list of the entitlements that I'm focusing on. In my book, I actually discuss others as well, but it gives you a sense, I think, of the unique way in which Cubans have been treated. And it wasn't just in the first years. And actually, it's not even true just before during the Cold War, because new entitlements were passed, as you might have noticed, in the post-Cold War period, and other entitlements that I haven't laid out have been passed since the Cold War ended. So, okay, so actually, it turns out there is a semi-qualified end to the story. So if I were lecturing in 2017, I would say the Cuban privileging as we knew it ended. On January 12th of 1917, right before, literally, Obama's last full week in office, he ends Cubans' rights to parole. And this turns unauthorized Cuban entrants into illegal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants for the first time after all those years. He also, he ended something called the Medical Professional Parole Program, which Bush II had initiated, that allowed Cubans who were serving in medical and nursing capacities overseas for the Cuban government as part of their overseas aid program, giving healthcare in poor countries. The Bush administration allowed these medics to, quote, defect and get paroled into the country. And it was really nasty to undermine the really good work that Cuba was doing in the global South. Retained by Obama was the guaranteed minimum of 20,000 legal entrants a year, something called the Cuban Family Reunification Program, which allowed U.S. citizens and also Cuban LPRs to apply for parole entry of their Cuban family and apply and bypass the admission queue, the admission waiting list, et cetera. And the Cuban Adjustment Act most significantly remained in effect, and the welfare rights. So those are key entitlements that were retained. So even in January of 2017, only certain of the entitlements were being retracted. So then comes Trump, right? Later in January 2017. And what does he do? Well, he actually, this is one thing I guess you could say, I mean, he builds on Obama and further retracts entitlements for Cubans. So one was in terms of entry. He de facto reduces the number of unauthorized immigrants that are allowed into the country, despite the bilateral agreement with Cuba to allow 20,000 a year in. And in 2018, for example, only 4,000 Cubans were given legal entry, as opposed to the 20,000 to which they were by agreement entitled to. And in that process, Trump is also suspending consular services to Cubans. Very few refugee admissions, despite the Refugee Act being in effect. And then he excludes Cubans who were entering. That was something that was really quite new. So deportations really increased significantly, as you can see, and detentions even more. Unknown, essentially, before January 12th, 2017, when Obama changed US policy as we knew it. So what Trump does is sort of take the exclusion to a new level. And these are policies that are not just affecting Cubans, but other unauthorized immigrants, many of them from Central America. And he outsources and offshores exclusion. So one was a metering system in where Cubans had to wait in Mexico to get into the United States to apply for asylum. And each of the ports of entry would only allow a small number in per day. More significant was a program known as Remain in Mexico, which was where the Cubans who were not being able to get into the United States to either request asylum or make their claims for asylum had to wait. Now, waiting in Mexico was not a pleasant thing. Very dangerous. They were, robbed. They were robbed. They were abducted. They were raped. All sorts of horrible things happened to them while they were waiting in Mexico. And actually, gangs in Mexico were sort of targeted the Cubans more than other immigrants there because they knew Cubans had access to more money through their networks in the United States. So they were more value to the drug gangs. And then the U.S. has been giving military assistance to Mexico to block unauthorized immigrants from the United States. And Mexico, since the Mexican Revolution, has really had a very small military, unlike a lot of Latin American countries. And the U.S. has been contributing to a buildup of the military, really to serve anti-immigration purposes. And then the Trump administration turned to Central American countries, namely Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to agree to, quote, safe third country agreements. These, of course, were even less safe, and equally unsafe, I should say, as to Mexico. So they really weren't safe places, but it was a way to force incoming immigrants who are coming by land, which since the mid-90s, most immigrants from Cuba have been coming by land, not by sea. And so these agreements required the co-signers to grant asylum to the Cubans who are on their way to get to the United States, but to insist that they get asylum in those countries as a way of keeping them out of the United States. The Biden administration actually retracts these. They were really not popular, to say the least. But that was a key point of the Trump policy. So then comes Biden. What does he do? He has not really done a lot. It is very difficult still to come into the U.S. into the U.S. legally if you're Cuban. There's a backlog of over 100,000 applicants. And under these circumstances, what has happened is that Cubans have shifted their strategy. Their ability to get in legally with a visa is very, very difficult. And for the last 4 years, the US has not been, essentially has not been granting visas. So what Cubans have done is to, try to get around the rules and try to get asylum. So that's become the main strategy of trying to get into the United States. And the others may be trying to do the same, but in the case of Cubans, because they have the Cuban Adjustment Act, and because the asylum hearings usually take more than a year before they take place. So that means a Cuban who is waiting for an asylum hearing, if they're in the United States, they then can switch and take advantage of the Cuban Adjustment Act, the CAA, to get legal entry, right? Because that's what the Cuban Adjustment Act allows. So the other immigrants would just continue to be unauthorized, but the Cubans have a way of getting around it, which is why I say it seemed, if I were talking in January of 2017, it did seem as Cuban privileging was ending. But what we're seeing is it's in continuing under new guises, essentially. And what we are really experiencing now, talking about 2022, is basically a land Marielle. The numbers who are coming to the US this year unauthorized are on track to exceed the number that came in 1980. But they're coming by land because the US Coast Guard police the Florida Strait. So they still are coming, and more of them are coming than in years past. Cubans are just desperate to leave. And so, but the Coast Guard are more efficient in blocking the Cubans. Not all, but they're more efficient in blocking the Cubans. And so the main way that they're coming is by land. Now that's been going on for several decades, but so it's not new. What happened in 2021 is that Nicaragua has allowed Cubans to come in from Cuba without a visa. And it shortens the trek to the United States, because before that, Cubans had to go to Ecuador and do a 7,000-mile trek from Ecuador to the United States. All of this is with human smugglers, right? They're being exploited, horrible conditions for this trek, especially the one that started in Ecuador. And so they're just coming and they're coming. I mean, it's like every month now I'm seeing an increase in the number who are coming. So I have some figures there, and just you can see the increase, that 39,000 in 2021, which was triple the number in 2020. And then already in 2022, in the fiscal year, which is not identical to the calendar year, already we're not halfway through the fiscal year, and we're up to 79,000 Cubans coming in. So they're unauthorized, but they're being let in. It's quite amazing. They just are bypassing all the regulations that are applying to other countries. It is now the second largest migrant population at the border, second to Mexico, which is interesting. So the Central Americans have been coming down and the Cubans have been going up. So what has been the Biden response to this surge in migration? Most Cubans who are reaching the border are being allowed to follow regular immigration processes and claim asylum. And that means they can stay in the US while they're making their asylum cases, while they're making the cases. And as I said, after 1 year, they just drop the asylum case and turn to the Cuban Adjustment Act and become legal permanent residents. In addition to that, the data is showing that most of the immigrants who are coming in from Cuba now, they are, if you look at the Homeland Security data, they're coming in a category that's called adjustment of status. And what does that mean? That means that they didn't come with authorization and they're able to switch their status, meaning they've changed it with the Cuban Adjustment Act. So the numbers are less, absolutely, than they were before Trump really clamped down on immigration in general. But the percentage of those who are coming in who are coming in under quote adjustment are basically the same percentages as was the case in the past. So they're also, as far as I can tell, they are exempt from the Title 42 rule, which may be of interest to some of you. I've seen some conflicting evidence of whether or not they're exemptions. So I would say, that's why I put a question mark. I have to delve into that a little farther. And Mexico, again, the US has turned to Mexico to do its dirty work, which is really what Mexico has been doing, and to accept some of the Cubans who have been expelled under Title 42. Now, this month, May 22, 2022, the US is finally beginning to start issuing new visas, immigration visas to Cuba, but very few, very slow, and who knows how many. So it is sort of a change from the, from the Trump policies, I would say, but minimally at this point. So why the Cuban privileging? It begins as Cold War, okay? The Cubans weren't getting privileges before January 1959 when Castro came to power, but then it starts, okay? It's intended to delegitimate and undermine the Cuban Revolution. So it was really an instrument of US foreign policy during the Cold War. But why has it continued in the more than a quarter of a century since the end of the Cold War, right? The basis shifts to domestic politics from foreign policy. And there's several explanations of this. One is that the early entitlements have transformed the Cubans into a domestic political force. And I should say with significant Reagan blessing, really helped them make that transition into a domestic political force. So Cubans have been able to elect they're a voting bloc, and they vote because thanks to the Cuban Adjustment Act, most Cubans, have become able to become citizens and have voting rights, unlike other unauthorized immigrants that enter the country, and they've used their voting privileges. Also, they happen to concentrate in Florida, which is the largest swing state. And neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have written the Cubans off as, have written them off as either Republican or Democrat, certainly not Democrat, because they tend to vote Republican. But, Florida during this period has gotten a lot more electoral college votes. It's in 1960, 10 votes. By 2020, 29 votes. So it's big time, the Florida vote. And they've been able to exert political power in these ways. And they had a very effective pact that was modeled after AIPAC. This was really under guidance from the Reagan administration. And AIPAC is the most successful ethnic, the most effective ethnic pact that exists, and that was the model for the Cuban one. The Cuban one has actually been, it seems to be fizzling out now, but it was very important for several electoral cycles. And I would say, the unspoken issue that also has worked to Cubans' favor is they're white. If you look at the census, which is self-definition, well, the early wave of Cubans, 97% white. I put white in quotes, but that's how they're identifying themselves on the census. But the percentage goes down, but not much. It's only in comparison. So I think now it's still over 80% would say they're white. So, the meaning of white has changed over time, but nevertheless, okay. So I would argue those are the issues. And then, my argument is path dependent, that the new entitlements have been given to address problems that earlier entitlements generated, new problems that arose, efforts to retract entitlements that have failed, and to empower Cubans. Because Cubans have been empowered as a result of earlier entitlements, they are able to push for the continuing of those entitlements. I fear I should be stopping at this point. I have a lot more I could be saying, but I mean, that's the argument and the evidence that I have. And so I think probably I should stop here. So we have plenty of time for comments if you want. I'm happy to go back and add more materials later if you want.
Hey, thank you very much for that overview, Susan. César.
Yeah. So can you remove the screen share?
Yes. Whoops. Good.
Okay, so can folks hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't know Susan was going to speak first, so some of this may sound redundant, but I prepare a kind of short review, which I will just read since I'm otherwise not a good public speaker. So Susan Eckstein's Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America, is an exhaustively researched and thorough examination of United States immigration policy towards Cubans after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. If anyone had any doubts that Cubans were treated exceptionally well by the United States immigration and welfare authorities relative to other immigrant groups and even relative to groups of US citizens, they will be disabused of their notions after reading this book. Eckstein traces immigration policy towards Cubans under 12 different presidents: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and Trump. She also tracks congressional legislation towards Cuba during the period 1959-2020. The research supports Eckstein's thesis implacably, namely that no other immigrant group received the privileges that Cubans received. A thorough command of the secondary literature combined with archival research into the documents of US agencies such as the State Department, the Congressional Record, the presidential libraries of multiple US presidents make this work an impressive scholarly achievement. No doubt it will become the book of record concerning Cuban immigration to the United States. It is impossible to present the full detail of such a thorough study in 10 minutes, or 15 actually. I will therefore highlight the central arguments. The United States government attempted to use immigration policy for foreign policy purposes by favoring the entrance of Cuban quote-unquote refugees or asylees into the United States. The central aim of the intervention was a failure in that it did not achieve the goal of overthrowing the revolutionary regime that emerged after the triumph of the 26th of July movement in Cuba. However, once initiated, the privileging of Cuban immigrants over other ethnic immigrants continued without interruption until the Obama administration in the 21st century. Eckstein frames her own argument as a past dependence argument. Once initiated, the Cold War utilization of immigration policy towards foreign policy ends created a track from which it was very difficult to derail. And Cuban privileging continued after the collapse of state socialism and the Soviet Union, which began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The privileging took essentially two forms: the facilitation of immigration and acquisition of legal permanent resident status for Cubans on the one hand, and the extension of state assistance, principally but not exclusively in the form of extension of welfare benefits to Cubans once they were in the United States. Concerning the facilitation of immigration, the Johnson administration aided through freedom flights negotiated with the Cuban government the movement of approximately 270,000 Cubans to the United States. The biggest difference between Cubans and all other immigrants is that they were quote unquote paroled into the United States as quote unquote refugees or asylees automatically, whereas an immigrant requesting political asylum needs to prove individually that they were persecuted in the home country. In the case of Cubans, merely being Cuban sufficed to grant them political asylum in the United States. This privilege was even extended to Cubans living on countries where they face no persecution, such as Spain or Mexico. From the point of view, from the Cuban point of view, Cuban in the island, The immigration of Cubans was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it helped the Castro regime to get rid of hostile populations that may have chosen to exercise their voice rather than exit Cuba. But on the other hand, it deprived the country of many professional and skilled workers. This early migratory wave was largely educated, middle class, and 97% white. Concerning the extension of benefits to Cuban, these range from relicensing programs to transition Cuban medical doctors and nurses into jobs in the United States, to the extension of SSI, supplemental security income, to special refugee benefits that exceeded the welfare benefits received by US citizens, something against which African Americans in Florida bitterly complained. For perspective, I wish to add the following facts. 3 weeks ago, on April 21, 2022, the United States Supreme Court, with only Sonia Sotomayor dissenting, decided in the case United States versus Baello Madero against the extension of SSI benefits to residents of Puerto Rico. People born in Puerto Rico have been United States citizens for 105 years as of 2022. By contrast, Cuban immigrants arriving in Florida were entitled to SSI upon arrival. This privileging of Cubans has existed not only with respect to other immigrants, but also relative to some groups of US citizens. I'm going to make a pause here and ask to be allowed to share my screen. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you can see it. Okay, I just want to mention this movie. It's a hilarious movie made in 1969 with Alan Arkin performing spectacularly in it. He plays a Puerto Rican father of 2 children. He's a widower in El Barrio in Spanish Harlem in New York. And because his situation is so difficult and his children are experiencing gun violence and so on, he decides to head to Florida, teach them how to speak with a Cuban accent, put them on a boat, have the current carry them back into Florida, where they will be received as Cubans. So they will enjoy all these benefits that the Cubans are enjoying. It's a spectacular movie. It's made in 1969. Spectacular performance by Alan Arkin, and it's also in Spanish here. And the Spanish poster says, "Es mejor ahogarse en el océano que en una alcantarilla." Anyways, that's an aside, but the privileging of Cubans has of course been, I'm trying to close my screen sharing. Give me a second. Stop share. Yeah. Criticized, by groups of U.S. citizens before. Once the initial cohorts of middle-class Cubans settled in Miami, they prospered and they created their own lobbies. The most successful lobby was the Cuban American National Foundation, whose leader, Jorge Mascanosas, was consulted by U.S. presidents on Cuban immigration policy, but particularly by Reagan. Under Reagan, the U.S. state went so far as to grant a front of the Cuban American National Foundation, the Cuban Exodus Relief Fund, the capacity to admit Cubans into the United States through, quote, the only privately run immigration program in U.S. history, end of quote. These are Eckstein's words. And to grant them refugee status, even though they were not fleeing persecution. From Eisenhower to the presidency of the second Bush, the privileging of Cubans happened as inexorably as the laws of physics. Even when presidents initially opposed some aspect of Cuban privilege, in practice, they ended up extending the horizontal, meaning the expansion of beneficiaries, and the vertical, meaning the expansion of benefits, entitlements of the Cuban immigrants. So, and the great merit of the book is that it goes into great detail about this. Eckstein distinguishes the old from the new Cuban wave of migration, especially after the Mariel boat lift brought 125,000 Cubans to the United States in 1980. The social composition of the immigrants changed. The new Cubans were more diverse. The new flow contained higher percentages of working class and non-white Cubans. the representatives of the old Cuban community sought to distance themselves from the new Cubans and stop defending Cuban entitlements with the same vigor as before. The Cuban American lobby weakened, and when the Obama administration moved to treat Cubans as the US treats any other immigrant group, no stiff resistance was presented by the organized Cuban lobby that represented the old community, while the new community lacked lobbies and representatives altogether. Thus ended under the Obama administration the privileging of Cubans, not completely, as Eckstein clarified. Trump, in turn, applied to the Cubans the same fiercely anti-immigrant logic he applied to other Latino immigrants or Muslims. In this, Trump's nativism has been consistent. The book makes comparisons throughout to Haitians and Dominicans and their relation to the US immigration regime. I cannot detail them here, but the overall thrust is that neither group received the red carpet reception of the Cubans. Now to my critique of the book, I'm almost done. This non-specialist on immigration has one question to ask respectfully. Immigration is not my field. The Cubans appear to be exceptional even with respect to other Cold War refugees, such as those arriving in US shores after the war in Indochina. Thus, it would seem that while Cold War factors are important in explaining the Cuban exception, they cannot account for the totality of the difference between Cubans and other groups. Mm-hmm. Here, I have a set of questions having to do with colonialism. Cuba occupies a special place in the US imagination and in the behavior of the US state. From Thomas Jefferson considering Cuba the natural southern boundary of the United States that eventually would be annexed, through the attempts of the Cotton Kingdom slave-owning aristocracy to make out of Cuba one, or in some plans even several slave-owning states to increase southern power in the US Senate, through the increase of filibustering expeditions in the 1850s to realize what one historian has called the Southern Dream of Caribbean Empire, the annexation of Cuba seemed imminent at many points of US history. During the War of 1898, only the formidable power of the farm lobby was able to prevent the annexation of Cuba. Together, the more than 20 states that produce beet sugar, plus Texas and Louisiana, which produce cane sugar, plus the more than 50 states that produce tobacco, emphatically did not want the annexation of Cuba because the uniformity clause and the commerce clause of the Constitution would translate into tariff-free entrance of Cuban sugar and tobacco into the US market. President Roosevelt's attempts to secure a reciprocity treaty with Cuba, establishing mutual free trade, were soundly defeated by Congress. Yet, Cuba became part of a colonial and semi-colonial sphere of the United States, comprising the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, the US Virgin Islands, and Hawaii. The integration of Cuba into the administrative and commercial structures of the US empire was exceptional since the beginning of the 20th century. In 1914, US bankers boasted that you could transfer a railroad car from Florida into a ferry carrying 30 wagons and unload it into railroad tracks in Havana with the same gauge, and therefore, which were the same gauge, and therefore continuous with the US railroad system. This phenomenal infrastructural integration meant that, quote, and I'm citing a pamphlet by the Guaranty Trust Company in 1914, quote, Cuban sugar and molasses may be loaded at the Cuban mills and forwarded through to the destination in the United States without transfer, while the heavy machinery from the United States can be loaded at place of manufacture and carried through to its Cuban destination without transfer. During World War I, when sugar became a strategic war material, the Sugar Equalization Board, headed by future President Herbert Hoover, administratively achieved the sale of Cuban sugar at below market prices to assist in the US war effort. In the throes of the Great Depression, when the US government created a system of sugar quotas to regulate the overproduction of sugar in the beet producing and cane producing states of the United States, plus in Hawaii, plus also the Philippines and Puerto Rico, which were then governed by US presidentially appointed governors. The so-called quote unquote independent Republic of Cuba also received this quota allocation by the US government. In many ways, Cuba was within this colonial polity, and a nation-based framework seems insufficient to explain Cuban exceptionalism. This point is emphatically articulated in Maurice Morley's book, The Imperial State, the United States and Revolution in Cuba, 1952 to 1986. This was published in 1989 and reviewed by Eckstein in 1989 in Contemporary Sociology, but not quoted in Cuban Privilege, by the way. Ada Ferrer's recent book, Cuba, An American History, and that's interesting, Cuba, An American History, which received the Pulitzer Prize, suggests how much the Cuban issue is an internal matter to the United States. This longer specific colonial dimension of Cuban history with respect to the United States would surely need to be incorporated to complete the explanation of the exceptional treatment the Cubans have received in the US polity. As a reminder, the residents of the Virgin Islands, Guam, and Puerto Rico are all US citizens, and Filipinos were considered US nationals, able to migrate and work in the US until independence in 1946, a fact highlighted by Rick Baldos in his magnificent study of Filipino migration. So, looked at from the optic of the gradated rights within a colonial orbit, such as the question, for example, of why Algerian Jews received French citizenship but not Moroccan Jews, or why US citizenship was extended to Puerto Ricans but not to Filipinos, perhaps the Cuban exception is not as exceptional as it looks when examined strictly within a framework of nation states. You know, my point here, and I will close here, is that Cuba was part of a colonial sphere where there was a graduated set of rights assigned to different territories, and that treating it merely as any other national state while erasing this peculiar colonial history kind of detracts from the goal of explaining, you know, what is by any account exceptional treatment by the US authorities. Okay, I'll end there.
Okay, thank you very much, César, for your comment. Susan, would you like to take just a couple of minutes to respond?
I'll take a couple of minutes because I'd like to leave time for the assembled to participate, including towards me or towards César's really interesting presentation. I mean, I guess I would say I loved your presentation, first of all. So thank you so much for having it. And it does make me think a little bit out of the box in which, you know, I sort of conceptualized my own study. And so, I mean, when you're pushing me, I guess there's a step further or backward, whatever the word is, because if you compare, let's say, the treatment of the Vietnamese after the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, there were differences. I mean, they did get benefits, but nobody's gotten them like the Cubans, right? And so it isn't just Cold War. You're absolutely right. I was, you know, in that sense, I'd say it's Cold War plus, but you're giving an explanation of the plus of why one really needs to go farther back in history to see the bedrock for the kinds of entitlements that they got, that they received. I mean, I'm not sure if in 1959 Cubans, if then they hadn't been treated so privileged, that the colonial argument actually would have held. But certainly once the ball got rolling, it seems to me, you know, you're absolutely right. It has roots in this. And, you know, you could argue it adds to the path dependency in that, you know, that there's this precedent for giving Cubans privilege that are rooted in this colonial heritage. I love the argument. I can't disagree. Thank you very much.
I'm glad there was no fight then.
I
was getting ready for it, you know.
I mean, I could bicker about particular things, but I think it's an interesting argument to think that one really needs to go back farther. You know, and I do think the race just as you were going on to discuss what's happening with Puerto Rico today, there was something distinctive on the basis of their race. That it's not just the colonial setup that contributes to it, and they just felt entitled. And they didn't initially. The Cubans didn't think they were staying. They fantasized, that this was just short term. And even U.S. policy, which I discuss in the book, we really don't have time. Some of the bizarre entitlements that the U.S. government gave was to train Cuban immigrants in leadership skills so that they could go back and be the future leaders of Cuba, and also the military. So I think there is something to your argument, but I think an awful lot was rooted in the kinds of policies that got going on day one in 1959. But thank you.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions from anyone on the call. If you'd like to electronically raise your hand, or you can also post in the chat.
Okay, David.
Go ahead, Roger. Yeah.
Okay, since no one else has volunteered yet. So thank you, Susan, for a very interesting presentation. Thanks, César, for those critical remarks. I was wondering, Susan, whether you could go a little deeper into depth into some of the policies that gave Cubans these exceptional rights. I was particularly struck by the actions undertaken both by Carter and then under the Clinton administration. So why did these, though they faced different circumstances, but why did they feel, that they were so compelled to provide the Cubans with additional entitlements? I don't recall the electoral circumstance. I don't remember whether Carter won Florida's votes in '76, nor do I recall what happened with Clinton. But if one would think that particularly Clinton would have been freer to retract some of these privileges.
Well, let me just go back to Carter, and this was in the election year. Okay, Carter did win Florida in 1976. He was one of the first Democrats in quite a while that won Florida. So it was very important to him to win Florida. So electorally, and this is after the hostage crisis in Iran, et cetera. So he's in bad shape, and there's a recession as he's going into the election. So there were just several factors that were working against him that I think he understood. So, he is trying his best to hold on to Florida and the Cuban vote. But the thing is, he also just couldn't control the Mariels. So you could say he was weak politically. How could he stop all these Cubans who were coming? The Cubans in the US, the so-called exiles, are picking them up, bringing them over.
Right.
It's just out of control. So you could say he lost it, or he would have had to put so much force that in itself would have been unpopular, and would have made him seem anti-refugees, So I think it is a combination of weakness and wanting the Cuban vote. And there's some combination just led him to ultimately give them this temporary status. But to his credit, he said they weren't refugees. He had just signed the Refugee Act 3 weeks before the Mariels started to come. And he just said they are not refugees and refused to let them get refugee benefits and get admitted as refugees. So then the question was, how do you get them in legally? So he, constructs this new immigration category just for them. With Clinton, he is building on the Mariel experience. So I think he's alerted much earlier to try to tame it. And so, quote, only something like 34,000 rafters appear in the Florida Straits in 1994, as opposed to 125,000. And that was craftsmanship, I would argue, on Clinton's part. You know, we only look at what happens, but it could have been very different if he didn't find a way to divert them. And, you know, he came down strongly, all the top brass in terms of immigration policy also said, you will never be able to stay in America, blah, blah, blah. You know, so they ship them off to Guantanamo, and then lo and behold, they're allowed in. I mean, it's just crazy. All these public statements, we're never going to let you in. And then they just come in. So I mean, Clinton, I think, was a better politician. And I think he also, you know, he wanted to get reelected. And he knew that that was important. He consults Mascanosa, who César mentioned, when he drafts his new policy towards diverting the Cubans to Guantanamo. And then he really can't stand, I'm blanking on his name now, Mascanosa, because Mascanosa just sort of himself tried to control US immigration policy in terms of Cubans. And so Clinton sort of puts a stop to the access that that Mascanosa has to the White House. So, but again, that was craftsmanship, you know, that he really kept him out of secondary policies that were made towards Cubans. But it's Florida. I mean, I do think Florida is a big part of the explanation. And as I said, since they are, you know, in a swing state, quote, every vote counts, except in 2000 when you're George Bush. But so, you know, it was just part of the strategy was how are you going to get the Florida vote? And so it just Cubans take on outside importance. But then, you know, what is so significant is that Clinton retracts one entitlement for Cubans. And he is the first president, I think, to retract an entitlement. And that was that you could not come by sea. And that's the term wet foot, dry foot policy is the wet foot refers to if you're caught in the Florida Straits, you're repatriated. You can't get into the country. And that part of the equation has sort of maintained itself since the mid-90s, whereas the dry foot one has just gotten totally out of control. I mean, so the policy was to make immigration safe and legal. And because it was unsafe before, right? There were all these rafters that were coming on anything in 1994. This was after the Soviet Union collapses and, you know, Cuba loses its main aid and trade partner. And Cubans are really desperate. They're pretty desperate now as the migration is picking up again. I don't think it's as bad as it was in 1995. People were really hungry. I mean, it's not famine, but if you looked at people, you almost had I had to sort of turn my head. It was so sad to see how skinny people had gotten because there was just so little food. And so it was a desperate situation. I think Clinton understood it could really, the migration crisis could have become a lot larger if he didn't find a way to tame it, which is how he came up with a diversion policy to keep the people out. But then, so he retracts the right for Cubans who are caught in sea to be able to come to the United States. Earlier, the Coast Guard was actually picking up Cubans and bringing them to the United States. Pick up a Haitian and bring them to the United States? You were sent back. But I mean, it's just the entitlements on entitlements, you know, informal or whatever. And, but in addition to that, Clinton went on to give several other entitlements, such as the minimum of 20,000 legal immigration slots a year. So took with one hand and gave a lot more with the other hand. And, you know, they're politicians who are just kind of navigating domestic politics is really what it turns out to be. That maybe is not a sufficiently compelling answer, but as I said, I mean, what I really do in more detail in the book is that when presidents did try to retract entitlements, they reversed themselves, except with that one exception about if you caught at sea. But at the same time, Clinton was really giving these other entitlements to Cubans. So I mean, it's interesting, which in my chapter on Obama, I go into, and when I try to explain why Obama changed the policy, which I didn't have time to go into. I mean, I give several reasons for that. One was, in a sense, he had nothing to lose because he was not running for re-election anymore in 2017. Secondly, the unauthorized immigration had gotten again out of control, as it is getting now. And the other thing was there was a split in the Cuban American community, which I've seen very little written about it, but really, as I was trying to write that chapter, I was really quite vocal, where the so-called exiles, that first wave, who are the political force in Miami, and their children. Okay, the new Cubans who come out in the post-Cold War, they're like other immigrants. They want to see their family, help their family, whereas the exiles, they support and promote, not just support the so-called personal embargo. Thou shalt not visit, thou shalt not send remittances to people in Cuba. It used to be that you return to Cuba without Castro, but they've had to tweak that part of their argument. But, and so in 1970, I'm sorry, in 2009, Obama, before he goes, I mean, this is really, in some sense, in the spirit of César, you have to really look at migration in broader context. So in 2009, Obama is about to go to a conference of the heads of state of the Americas, and they've been pushing him on his Cuba policy. And it was really outrageous, the embargo. They stopped supporting the US on the embargo, et cetera. So he had to do something before he went to the conference, because he knew he's just going to be pounced on. And when he was campaigning, and he did well in Florida, he got about half the Cuban votes, which was unheard of. You know, he was arguing for loosening up the policies that the Bush administration had put in effect to limit remittances. Cubans couldn't send remittances to their families, very little, or they could only visit every 3 years. I mean, really restrictive policies were implemented under Bush too, and that was under pressure from the exiles. It was in support for their, in return for their support in the 2000 election. So then Obama, you know, is trying to get the Cuban vote in the election. And so he comes in trying to appeal to the newer Cubans who do want to go to Cuba, who do want to see their family. So he promised to change the policy. So quickly before he goes, I think it was in March of 2009, was this conference of the heads of states of the Americas. He changes the policy and allows Cubans to go visit their families, send remittances, et cetera. And the exiles are furious. So they are now trying to turn on the new Cubans who will want to travel to Cuba, send remittances, and threatening them that they're not going to get their entitlements anymore. And so it was, in a sense, there was a political space that was created within a divide within the Cuban American community. I think that made it much easier to change Cuban policy. Well, that was 2017. Now, you know, since Bush, since Trump, there's been so much retraction of everything. It's hard to, it really was a window of opportunity that, you know, Obama seized to modify Cuban policy to allow visits, remittances. And now I think the Biden administration is going to reopen some of these things, but it's slow. So in other words, these policies are embedded in these broader bilateral issues, I would say. And that, I think, partly explains why they do what they do.
Other questions? We have a question here in the chat. I'll summarize it here. 2 questions. Early support for Cuban immigration policy was largely in democratic administrations. Do you believe that anti-communist rhetoric answers the full story for partisan alignment for Cubans?
Can you repeat the question?
Do you believe that anti-communist rhetoric answers the full story for partisan alignment for Cubans, away from the party that gave benefits?
Well, I'd like to hear what that person was thinking of at the time. I mean, look, Eisenhower it starts under Eisenhower in 1915. The revolution is January 1, 1959. So Eisenhower is president in 1959 and 1960. So it begins under Eisenhower. He starts the parole, he starts refugee benefits, etc. So JFK picks up on that and expands it. He's not the initiator. And then Johnson takes it to this other level, which was just remarkable. Any Cuban could come, and of course that was rhetoric, but to say that also at the same time as you're getting rid of national quotas was quite remarkable. And so Johnson, not sure why was he so generous? I mean, is it everything becomes it's always a mix of domestic and foreign policy. And I just think over time, the domestic becomes more important than the foreign policy. But this was also, he's trying to get votes in Florida. So it's certainly not immune from domestic politics at that very point. And that's something like 250,000 Cubans came in after that famous speech in 1965, before Nixon ended it. So I don't know, I don't see it as a partisan issue. I remember attending a talk of Doug Massey pre-COVID, so a few years ago, on deportations, and he made the argument he made just resonated with me. He said it's not partisan, and he documented how the deportations just keep going up, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And I would say that was really what's going on. And as I said, because Florida takes on so much importance, it's important to both Democrats and to Republicans. It's, and ideology means less than pragmatic political interests. I guess is maybe how I would ultimately come down on it.
So I have a question, which is to invite you to reflect on what the implications are of your book for the broader study of assimilation and integration in the US.
Oh, that's good, because actually, if I had given the rest of my PowerPoint, I end by saying that, I abstract about some of the implications, but I do end it saying that the US should extend to other immigrant groups the kinds of entitlements that they've given to Cubans, because it's had such a positive effect. I mean, Cubans have contributed a lot to the United States. A lot of them have been wealthy, not, especially the ones who came first, but not only, and the ones even who came first, they benefited from, a small business, special small business association loans. And I mean, there were just a lot of ways in which they got benefits that helped them do well. So they, their own human capital, etc. But it was a mix there too of human capital and entitlements. And I think it does show the benefits of legalizing immigrants, because there you see, once you're authorized, I mean, there's a sense of security that they have, and you can vote, and you can qualify for welfare and other kinds of benefits. So I would say yes, there's a bottom line point that I do end the book with by saying this should be, it should serve as exemplary US policy about what should be, not that the entitlements should be equalized, but not by taking them away from the Cubans, but rather by extending similar kinds of entitlements to other immigrant groups. No other questions? I mean, if you want, I can go back and add a little bit more that I didn't discuss. I just wanted to not hog the time and give César the time he deserved. So that's up to you.
Yes, César.
César has it.
So I have a question about selectivity, which is a big word now in migration studies. I'm not from the field. So the early wave, have there been any studies of like comparing the old Cubans with the new Cubans in terms of the human capital they brought with them, or even the social capital? Because I have a sense that part of the explanation for the Cuba, a lot of these people were linked to U.S. corporations in Cuba, had jobs. This was a middle class really, really integrated into U.S. business structures already when they arrived. On a personal note, I was born in 1960. I grew up in Puerto Rico with a number of Cubans my age who maybe arrived when they were 1 year old or 2 years old, had no memories of Cuba. And I recall many other parents had U.S. corporate jobs in Cuba. Before coming to Puerto Rico, and they just relocated, and they did something of the sort. So, some kind of comparison between the human capital skills, levels of education and so on of the first wave, and the social capital understood here as actually job networks and so on that they may have possessed pre-existing, when they left Cuba, with the second wave, which naturally would not have had as many linkages and so on, but maybe it was just as educated. I don't know. Basically, my question is about human and social capital and the two waves, or the old and the new migration.
So I wrote a book called The Immigrant Divide, which is, it had some subtitles to let you know what it was about, but I can't remember it right now. And in that book, which I published in 2009, just to date the material that was in it, I really spent a lot of time on comparing the different waves of immigrants. So to me, I actually put the big divide between those who came out in the post-Soviet era and earlier. I mean, there's the Mariel, I'd say, a middle group within that period, but in the post-Soviet period, they're really like other immigrants. They're very, yes, they may say they didn't like Castro, but it wasn't like passion and it wasn't driving them. And they really wanted to come for a better life economically. And that's a very different mentality than the ones that came out first, that many of them came out really to maintain or improve their economic lot too. But their definition of self was that they were political exiles. In a technical sense, they weren't exiles, but that's how they viewed themselves, and it was real in its consequences too. So there are differences in that book. I actually do a lot of cohort comparisons, so you can see, and over time, how the different cohorts are doing. And I also discussed more qualitatively, which is probably my strength, is how the earlier Cubans, looked down on the new Cubans that came. So they had their own internal differentiation. And, we're very, even in Union City, New Jersey, where I did some work, which was where the poor people, not poor, but the poor immigrants in the 60s came into the greater metropolitan New York labor market. And they were just looking down on the new Cubans not the new Cubans, but the Cubans who came in later, whether it was the Mariels or since 1989, I'm sorry. So there is, social differentiation. And I just actually was reading something, I think today, about the new immigrants who are migrating now. These unauthorized immigrants are coming, that they come without the kinds of networks, the social capital that the earlier immigrants have. So I read something in passing. It was not presented with any evidence. I was kind of surprised that it was incorporated into what I read. So yes, that one of the reasons, in the issue of human and social capital, I think there are differences, but education's been really quite good in Cuba. So it's not the elite education that they had. A lot of the first wave went to private schools, right? Some of that which relocated in Miami afterwards, building on your idea of, these kinds of connections. And of course, all that's gone by the time the new immigrants are coming. So even when they get the same education, you could argue the latent functions of schools have changed in the post-Cold War, I would say, and under Castro in general. So yeah, I think there are differences that explain some of them. And I don't think everybody who came was employed in corporations, but you could be sure that the ones who come out more recently never had a connection to the corporation. So, you know, there is that difference. But I know a lot of Cubans who came early on who were professionals, you know, they weren't in the corporate world. So probably the corporate world is a small part, but that class just emptied out. There's no question about it. So, you know, there are these levels of nuances, I think, that are going on that explain differences over time within the Cuban community.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for laying this out for us. We look forward to seeing the book in print here within the next few weeks. Thanks also to César for his comments. And I hope that you'll be able to join us next Friday, May 20th, for our methods workshop on using government data and migration research. And I wish everyone a happy weekend.
Thank you.